My name is Hein Toliard. I'm the head of digital data at ABM Systems. Joining me today is Daryl Clark, Director of Solutions Engineering at AvePoint. Welcome, Daryl.
Thanks, Hein. Glad to be joining this. Really exciting time. Interesting is probably the better way to describe it. What's happening with people sort of working from home at the moment with Microsoft Teams. And obviously that's a big part of what we're going to be focusing on in this session today.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The Q&A is on the right-hand side. Feel free to push any questions that you may have during the webinar. We will try and get to as many of the questions at the end. The recording will be made available to everybody, which we'll distribute later today. And then, yeah, feel free to ask as many questions as relevant. And we're going to try and do our best to answer as many of them as we can. So just quickly, what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be looking at some of the challenges with remote teamwork, and what does that look like? And then when we think about what an effective remote teamwork solution might look like, what are the kind of things that we need to consider? We're going to take a quick look at what AvePoint's answer to this problem is. Daryl's going to take us through some scenarios and a little bit of a demonstration. And then we've got some exciting news around how we can get started really leveraging this very quickly. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the questions and answers. Cool. So what does teamwork look like today? This is obviously emphasized with everybody working from home, but we've got a lot of disjointed sort of collaboration initiatives. We've got file shares and people are using Slack. Whether it's from a cultural diversity or from an age group perspective or from a technological maturity perspective, people are using different types of collaboration methods. This causes a bit of a problem for IT, where if we don't enable people, the people in organizations, they've become quite comfortable with the fact of branching out of what IT allows us to do. So this does create a bit of a problem for IT in that perspective. Obviously, you know, IT, despite what most people believe, IT actually is quite busy on a day-to-day basis, and there's a lot of resources that need to go into supporting an effective collaboration model. Obviously, from an infrastructure perspective, all of that needs to consider as well. And then finally, we need to start thinking when we're looking at an effective collaboration model in the modern workplace, we need to start considering beyond the boundaries of what a traditional sort of infrastructure would look like, where we can assume that everybody's at the office working on our file shares, has access to our SharePoint sites. And this is really the problem that I think Microsoft's tried to solve and quite effectively solved with Microsoft Teams. However, you know, with each new solution comes a new set of problems, and that's really what we're here to discuss today. So when we're looking at Microsoft Teams, we really have two options that we sort of, or two mainstream initiatives that IT does. The first is the organic, where we basically allow everybody to provision for themselves. And this is really sort of the out-of-the-box way when you instantiate an Office 365 instance. And the big caveat there is we're trusting users to know what they need, to know what they want, to work securely, and those kind of things. The other side of this is where we have the traditional approach where IT creates groups for teams, and that's a laborious process where somebody needs to fill out and then wait for IT to address the request, and that creates a substantial burden on IT. The problem with the IT approach, when we look at only IT being allowed to create teams, we are creating barriers where it becomes a substantial problem for users. And eventually over time, because it's quite frankly a pain to actually get something spun up where we can collaborate with our teammates and colleagues, eventually we'll just go back to what we know and what is as the path of least resistance when it comes to collaboration. The net result is Teams adoption dwindles, and that's not really a scenario that is feasible anymore. So IT sits with quite a few challenges when looking at Teams. These are a few of the screenshots that IT actually need to consider when managing Teams. So it becomes a substantial issue for them, considering the security, There's a lot of manual activity that needs to happen in a multitude of systems. So we need to worry about SharePoint. We need to worry about Exchange and OneDrive and security, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side of the coin is when we sort of leave users to figure it out. So Teams is relatively intuitive, or so we think, but it's also a pretty new tool, right? Teams is only 3 years old now, and even the most progressive of technologists and technologically advanced companies, we're still trying to figure out exactly what are the real best practices. What's the
hello everyone. The demo god certainly went with us at the moment. Heinz PC just blue screened on him, so he'll be back online in just a second. Okay, all right, so I'll take over from here until the Heinz back up and running again. So one of the things I was sort of highlighting before is that the whole just sort of turn it on and let the users figure it out and things like that. Look, that's certainly an approach that we've seen happening a lot, particularly with what's happening in the world where organizations were forced to work from home probably much quicker than they'd sort of planned to. I know that they've probably seen quite a few of the memes and things like that that have been around that say who's responsible for the digital transformation in the organization. It's like CEO, CIO, or COVID-19. I know in my role, I've spoken to a lot of organizations where this has really expedited their approach to start working remotely much quicker than they'd anticipated. And that's one of the great things about Microsoft Teams is that you can get up and running really, really quickly with it. But what sort of starts happening after a while is that if you go in natively into Office 365, there are 13 different ways to create an Office 365 group, and they're not all the same. The other part of that as well is that if we sort of allow lots of teams to get created and we don't have some, say, things like consistency and things like that, the really good example that I often see is that if we don't have something as basic as a naming convention, so we don't end up with 5 teams that are derivatives of HR or human resources. Once you get to that point, if I'm a user and I'm trying to find the content that I'm after and things like that, that can be a really frustrating experience. And if I'm not continuing to get value out of it, at the end of the day, that's the thing that we're after here. We're after sustained long-term adoption. It's great that everyone's sort of using Teams quickly and things like that, but we need to make sure that we continue to get value out of it. So we need to make sure that the right controls and things like that are in place. Otherwise, users will just revert and look for other ways to collaborate. All right, Heinz back online now, so I am going to hand back to him.
Hey everyone, sorry about that, a bit of trouble. So as Daryl said, when we're thinking about these users, there are quite a few options. The sort of screen that we're looking at now, these are all native options out of the Teams app. For a user, this can be quite daunting, and it also allows for mistakes to happen and people to share potentially sensitive information. So as Daryl said, with the long-term sustainability of our Teams adoption, we need to find a way where we give users this middle ground, where we don't allow them to be their own worst enemy, but we also want to enable them to be as productive as possible. For those of us coming from the SharePoint background, we know that we can't have a situation where we have no self-service. Self-service really is become a mainstream concept in most organizations. We have to allow for any sort of sustained adoption of any platform. There must be a self-service environment. But on the other side of the coin, there is we don't want people to have carte blanche on what they can and can't do. And this is where the concept of automation really starts playing along a big role. If you look at regardless of how we approach automation, our ability to roll out a service to our customers inside the organization, whether it be through substantial scripting or building Power Apps or using Power Automate or third-party applications like AvePoint, automation is the way we consistently roll out the service and give our customers the type of experience that they need. So when we're looking at automation or for the sort of remote collaboration, teamwork structure, there are a few key points that we need to sort of address to make it successful. So the first thing is we want to reduce the amount of touch points that people have. I need to know where to go to create a team. I need to have a very intuitive, wizard-driven sort of provisioning process. So I don't have to go and figure out teams. I know I want a team, and I want to share it with these kind of people, and here are sort of the kind of things that I want to do with it. But I don't want to have to know how Teams works in the background, right? The second part, this is very important from both an adoption and from a governance perspective, is we want to stay connected with our users, right? Throughout our team's lifecycle, when we've spun up a project for them and we've created a space for them to collaborate, we need to ask the question around, how's it going? Are you getting the value that you want? What are you having trouble with? So this is very important, for us to identify what our processes need to look like, but it also gives us great insight into how our user base is adopting our platforms and how we can address that and what we can proactively address in the organization. We obviously want to monitor usage and behavior to see what we're doing when we're collecting this feedback in step 2. We want to see how our teams are actually using it, to obviously produce a better experience and to obviously continuously improve our experience of Microsoft Teams, but also quite importantly to make sure that we stick to our security and governance guidelines. And then very importantly, and this is where it becomes sort of critical, it almost is that last mile problem, where when a team is no longer needed, right, what do we do with it, and what does that process look like? What do we need to keep the data, the documents? Do we want to keep the posts? Whatever the case might be, right? This entire process needs to be underpinned with rigorous security and data retention policies. It becomes quite important. Obviously, there's a lot of potential sensitive IP that gets this created in these teams, and as with our recordings and like at ABM, we record all our meetings now, all our sort of executive or sales meetings, we record it because that's valuable IP that we can retain instead of going back through notes. We need to understand how that sort of plays into the bigger role. So this is sort of the picture that we need to solve for. But when you look under the covers of each of these blocks, it becomes quite a cumbersome and onerous process for IT. And this is where, once again, we sort of look to automation to ease the burden, to marry the worlds of IT requirements and a great user experience. Well, this is where I would have given over to Daryl, but I'm going to ask Daryl to step back in at this point.
Okay, so what I'm going to go over is our approach, being AvePoint, to how we tackle some of the challenges that Hein identified through his part of the presentation. So a little bit about AvePoint. So we are a software vendor. We've been around for about 18 years now, and I'm not going to go through the entire history and things like that, but a big part of what we sort of do now is in the Office 365 space, and particularly as it pertains to the management, the classification, and the retention of content in Office 365. Now, we're talking a lot about Microsoft Teams and some of the governance and controls that we can put in place to ensure that we get that sustained adoption. And I would say in regards to my sort of day-to-day, 95% of my conversations at the moment are around, we've rolled out Teams, we had to turn it on. We need to make sure that when our users are empowered to be able to use this fantastic solution, but we also need to make sure that when they're using it, they're doing it in such a way that if there's content being created that's really valuable, that I'm keeping it as long as it needs to be kept for, or if there are certain workloads that we have, I need to be able to ensure that that content isn't being shared out externally, potentially with people that shouldn't have access to that type of information. So that's one of the great things with Microsoft Teams. It's so quick and easy to get up and running with it. The challenge that a lot of organizations are sort of struggling with a bit now is that I need to keep empowering users to work, especially as they're working from home and things like that. But I am concerned from an information management standpoint that how is content being shared? Who has access to what? How am I ensuring that at the end of it's a team's information management lifecycle that I'm keeping that content as long as I'm supposed to according to the regulatory requirements? So our approach to it, and one of the things that I really like to do is I like to remove the technical jargon out of it. So we're obviously talking Microsoft Teams at the moment, but it's not just Teams necessarily. It could be Office 365 groups. It could be the SharePoint sites and the site collections that get created as well. How do we ensure that all those sort of artifacts are provisioned, managed in a compliant fashion that really empower and done at a pace that empowers end users to keep being able to be productive from where they're working? So one of the things that AvePoint like to do is to use a questionnaire. So it's not really about who you are and what you want to do. It's about what's the business requirement that you have. So I'm not going to ask them, hey, what's the recertification policy that I need to apply, and what's the inactivity threshold that I need to set in your team? If I'm an end user, I don't care about that. I just care about getting up and running and collaborating and being productive in this new working environment that I'm in now. So by using a questionnaire, I can automate a lot of those decisions that need to be made, which ultimately speeds up the end user experience and increases adoption, because once I know those sort of answers, I can go off and automatically provision. So I'm not sort of going backwards and forwards to a help desk or things like that, sort of trying to ask those questions. As Heinz sort of mentioned before, IT help desk and things like that are being stretched far more than they probably ever have been in recent history because of the nature. We're trying to support people working from home. Heinz computer just died recently. I imagine that's going to be a help desk ticket that's going to be raised really, really soon. So we need to make it easier for us to be compliant with how we want users to work. The second part of that as well is ensuring that if a team is provisioned, that we're backing it up according to the relevant life cycle we need to adhere to there. So an example could be if we were creating a site around a one-off initiative, or it was say more of a, I know at AvePoint, we are having every Friday, we have a all hands meeting, and it's a way for us to catch up, and like we would have done in the office. Last week, one of my colleagues baked Anzac cookies and things like that. So it's a bit more informal. So when we create that team, I don't need to back up that content for very long. Whereas if it's something around an external collaboration around an RFP, or if I'm working with an external company, I need to ensure that I'm retaining that information a lot longer. Those are the sort of things that, based on the questions that I ask at the start, I can automatically apply those retention policies and things like that as well. Now, the final part that we sort of incorporate into the solution, I think is really important, is the concept of recertification. Now, I think this is probably one of the most important parts of any Office 365 rollout. And if you look at Office 365 groups, I think they're absolutely fantastic because they empower end users to quickly and easily get up and running. Because if you look now, we don't just work within organizational silos anymore, department silos. We work cross-organization. So a traditional on-premises AD group was never going to cut that, where it's controlled by IT, it's really locked down and things like that. Now, the challenge that we have that introduces is that if I leave an organization, or if I've externally shared with somebody, how do I ensure that the right people are continuing to have access to that information? So one of the things that we like to do is to say, again, driven from the questionnaire, based on the sensitivity of the content, I may say, because let's say take a certain department, because that content and information is really sensitive, I'm going to ask you to recertify who has access to that content every 6 months. Now, if it was, say, our weekly stand-up, I'm not going to assign a task for that because it's not required. I don't really care who has access to that because I know it's all internal. But what I can do with that is I'm putting the onus back on the owner of the information, which is the team owner or whoever we're delegating for that. That's not an IT function. There's no way, particularly with how we're working now, we can expect IT to know who should and shouldn't have access to that content. There's no way they could do it. So let's assign that task to the end users or the owner of the team. And that way we get a digital audit trail to show that we are regularly checking who has access to this content. And if we don't do that, if the owner of the team doesn't do it, I can escalate either to their boss or things like that, or take the ownership of that team off them until they become compliant. And again, it's really about reducing that IT overhead for those sorts of tasks. So a bit of an example around that. So as Heinz sort of pointed out, you can do a lot of fantastic stuff out of the box or natively with Office 365 and Microsoft Teams. So you can do things around the provisioning and the life cycle. You can apply policies regarding the retention of content and things like that. But one of the things that we've noticed, and I imagine everyone on the call sort of seen the same as well, is that different divisions and different departments don't all have the same requirements. They work differently. Some collaborate externally, others definitely aren't allowed to. So we know there are different needs around all those sorts of things as well. So we need to be able to right size those requirements around what they need to be able to do. Now, the challenge with natively is that if you applied at the tenant level, everyone gets treated the same. If you wanted to apply different settings to, say, let's take example Department A. So Department A could be the legal team. Now, what we could do is say, because we know they're legal, they're not allowed to externally collaborate due to the sensitivity of their information. And we may have a different approval process around who's allowed to do that. And because of the nature of their content, every 3 months, I'm going to ask them to recertify. Department B, especially in this day and age, that could be our marketing team, where they're working with external vendors and digital agencies and things like that. And they need to be able to externally collaborate with people outside the organisation. Now, because of the sensitivity of their information, I may only ask them to recertify every 6 months. Now, the other part of that as well is inactive sites. Now, you can see in this example here, we've done every 12 months. Because one of the things may be, just because a team hasn't been accessed for a year, doesn't mean that content's no longer valuable. But we need to be able to have the approach in place or the technology in place to be able to ask that question. Because sometimes it hasn't been used for a year, we can get rid of it, or we may give the owner of the team the opportunity to re-extend that lease. Now, as you can see with all of these, there's different types of settings and things like that you can do. Now, you can certainly, if you were to do this manually, you would have to intercept every request. So have like a form around the provisioning that Hein was talking about, but you would need to capture each one of those and then go off and right size those, writing PowerShell scripts and things like that. Now, at a certain point, it would be hard to scale, especially as we've seen the dramatic adoption of Microsoft Teams. So our approach is really about automating those sorts of things. So going back to that questionnaire, if I know who they are and the type of work they're doing, I don't need to ask them these questions. If I'm an end user, I don't care about a recertification policy or what a retention period is. I just want to get my job done as efficiently as possible in these sort of trying times. So if we can structure all those things so we don't need to ask them these questions, and we automatically right size and put the right controls behind it. So the ongoing part of that is that we're going to ensure long-term sustained adoption, because we're putting the right sort of barriers up to make sure that we don't end up with 15 teams called HR, or we're not inadvertently sharing content that we shouldn't be, or we're not disposing of content earlier than we should according to its information management lifecycle. So what I want to do now is I'm going to sort of jump backwards and forwards a little bit. I want to take you through a few different user scenarios that we sort of commonly see. And then ultimately, I want to actually show you our solution in play and what that looks like. Because ultimately, you know, we can have the coolest system in the world behind the scenes with all this logic and things like that, but it's got to be user friendly to the end users. If it's not easy for them to consume, they're not going to use it. It's kind of like what we used to see with some of these sort of legacy, old school document management systems and records management systems. You know, they were great about retaining information, things like that, but there was such a barrier to entry for the end users because they weren't designed with them in mind. the way that we've sort of done it is that we're really trying to empower the users, but making sure we're capturing enough information so we can put the right controls in place automatically. Okay, so the first scenario, creating a new collaboration space. Okay, so in this scenario here, now you can see I've used the term collaboration space, and even though we're talking about Microsoft Teams, if I'm an end user, I don't ultimately care if it's a team, if it's a Yammer site, if it's a SharePoint site, if it's a document library. I just want to get up and running. Now, what we sort of do in this particular scenario here, so this is Sam. Sam works in marketing, and at the moment Sam's using Dropbox to collaborate with external vendors and things like that, and he's using email. So he wants a centralized place for everyone to be able to work together on all the content, and the records team want to ensure that when that content's being created, that the right retention policies are being applied automatically, so that content is being treated according to the information management policies that they need to adhere to. So in this scenario here, Sam's going to go into our application and click create a collaboration space. So again, Sam doesn't care what a team is. He's been using Dropbox, just wants to be productive. We're going to ask Sam some questions, and that's going to allow us to capture some information. Now, in this scenario here, we can have IT approve it, and then it goes off and creates the team and applies the right controls automatically, as you can see in points 2 and 3. What I would suggest is that we actually have an automated approval. And what we do is we ensure that we don't get all those teams being created that aren't being used, because if you look at point 3, we're going to apply an inactivity policy and a recertification policy automatically. So that way we're not waiting for IT to have to hit yes or no or things like that. We're empowering the end users to get up and running really, really quickly, but we're ensuring that we're not going to get all these dormant teams that aren't being used, because we're going to clean them up according to that inactivity policy. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I am going to jump into my demo environment. All right, so I am in the web client here for Microsoft Teams, and the reason for that is I don't want to start creating teams in my production environment here. Now, what you can see here on the left-hand side, this is our solution called My Hub. It's a native Microsoft Teams application that we've produced. And the reason that we did this, so look, our governance solution has been around for about 9 years now. So it started out on premises around provisioning SharePoint sites, site collections, things like that, all those sorts of admin tasks that administrators used to do on premises. Now, since we've moved to a SaaS sort of offering and working with Office 365 groups and teams and having that really close relationship with Microsoft, we've developed this application because it seemed counterintuitive to ask a user to create a team, to leave the application and go to a different website only to come back. So it's fully integrated. You can easily deploy it just by clicking a couple of buttons in your Office 365 environment. And to an end user, it looks like it's part of the Microsoft Teams ecosystem. So what I'm going to do here, I could spend several hours going through all the parts of the solution. It's very, very powerful, but I'm going to go and start a request here. And I'm following that same process flow that I showed you before. And what we're going to actually do is we're going to go and we're going to fill out a questionnaire, and we're going to create a Microsoft team. So you can see here, create a collaboration workspace. It doesn't say create a team. Because one of the things that could happen with this is that if we ask the right questions, the outcome could actually be joining an existing team. And I'll show you what that looks like. So if we go here, say, have you checked to see if a team already exists that meets your requirements? If they say no, it's going to direct me to what's called the group hub to see if a team already exists. So the group hub is a part of our solution where it lists all the Office 365 groups and teams that exist in your environment. So if I have a look here and go, oh, actually, there's a team that already exists around animal management, what I'm going to do instead is actually ask to join that team instead. So it changes the type of request. So if I'm an end user, I would rather be in the team where all my colleagues are working than going creating another team called animal management then we end up with 2 and we have information in both and we don't have a single source of truth. And if you take that back from an IT standpoint, like the end user's happy because their work up and running really, really quickly. But if I'm IT, that's one less site that needs to be created. So everybody's happy, everyone's able to be collaborative and working much quicker than they were if we'd gone and created that other team. So let's go back to the My Hub. So let's say in this scenario, I've gone, yes, I have checked, there's not one there. Will this space contain external users? So this is a really, really simple type of question, and we can make this as complex or as in-depth as we'd like, but it's a bit of an art and a balancing act. And I know when we've done implementations, it's kind of like we don't want to go and ask 35 questions because it's just a barrier to entry. It's making it too hard. We need to get the balance right of capturing enough information so we can put those right sort of right size the implementation as according to those other scenarios that I showed you. But we need to also make sure that we're not slowing the users down too much to be able to get up and running, because otherwise, as Hein showed before, they will go off and use other workloads instead. So let's say, yes, there are going to be external users. So what we're going to do, because I know they're external users, and if you remember my PowerPoint, I'm going to apply a recertification policy that ensures that every 6 months, because you've got external people in this environment, I am going to ensure that you are validating those are the right people who have access, because there is a higher risk of information leakage due to you allowing external people in the environment. Now, this form here, it's really, really simple, and I've sort of done it in such a way to show you some of the things that are possible. You can make this as streamlined as you would like. So what I'm showing here is, do I want to create a team from scratch, or do I want to be able to use one of the existing teams templates that exist in the environment? Now, we could craft the questionnaire in such a way, and I could look up that what department you're in and go, well, I know you're in IT, so I'm going to create every team using the IT content management template as an example. So it's one less question to ask. I'm really big on the more that we can automate by looking up attributes and things like that, we should certainly do that to speed up the end user experience. So let's select this template as an example. Now you can see here, I've set the default for this team to be private, but see, it's grayed out. So I can take a few different actions. I can show them the decision that's being made and I've made it on their behalf. I can ask for the person filling it out input like I'm doing here, or I can just gray it out and I can just hide it so it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. Now you can see in this one here, so I'm asking about for creating the external team, what are the members that are going to be in it? So I'm logged in as AvePoint Australia, so it's made me the owner by default. Now I can add people, or what I can also do as well is I can look up, this is creating a dynamic group in Office 365. So if I want to look up what department the user's in, and this is a real common one if you're doing department-based ones. And the great thing about this is you don't then have to go in and every time a new person joins the organization, you don't have to go and add them to each team. This will automatically ensure that they're being added to the team. So what we're doing is say every user where their department equals sales, they're going to be a member of this team. So you can see the rule here. Now, what I'm showing you here, again, I can automate this sort of stuff. I can look up the business unit, that's department. But the reason that I'm showing it here is I'm using it to drive the naming convention of the team here. So that way I can ensure there's consistency around, and I can build up prefixes and suffixes and things like that. But I'm using that to make sure that every team has that same sort of naming convention. So when I want to do reporting and things like that, it allows me to do that sort of stuff. Now, the final part here, I'm asking them what the security classification is of the content. Now, depending on the classification, I can then ensure that the correct retention policies and that are being applied to that information. So then I hit submit, and then that will go off and provision that team. And you can see here it's showing the different teams and that I request that I've made. and that's going off into the process. You can see it already added me in the bottom right hand corner there, so it's already starting to provision that as we speak. All right, so the second part that I wanted to sort of go through here was the onboarding of existing teams. So we know a lot of organizations have gone off and created a whole bunch of teams through what's sort of happening, the massive adoption, which has been great. Now, one of the things that people want to do, go, well, it's great that you show me all these controls and stuff like that. How do I apply these to all the teams that have already been created? So what we can actually do, you can see in this scenario here, we can import all those Office 365 objects and then apply those policies that we spoke about to the existing team. So what I will do, I'm going to apply an inactivity policy and a recertification policy, but I'm also going to apply department metadata. So I'm going to look up who created the team, apply that tag, because that allows me to do some things around reporting. So I know the naming convention may not be crash hot because you didn't have those controls in place, but at least by adding that, I can now run some reports and go, well, why does finance have 50 teams, but there's only 15 people in the department? That may be okay, I'm not sure, but it gives me some additional insight to what my environment's actually doing that I didn't have before. Now, what we can do as well is we can use this as an opportunity to ask every user, do you actually still require this team or not? And if they say no, I can dispose of it. But if they don't give me an answer, I can escalate to IT or their boss. And then what I can do is I can set the team to archive. So I'm going to use the native teams archiving that exists in Office 365. And I might keep that for a period of time before disposing of it. At least that way I can ensure that I'm giving users an opportunity to see if I actually did require that team. Because you will find a lot of cases people have just pressed the new team button and didn't really think about it and never bothered to get rid of it. This is a way to sort of get your environment back under control and ensure that, you know, all those other teams that have already been created, you're applying the same control and rigor that you are to the ones that you're doing using our solution going forward. All right, so that's probably the last bit that I really wanted to speak about. We could probably throw open to some questions now. All right, so one of the questions that I can see here is how do we ensure that when a team's created for a certain department that we're backing up that information specifically for that team? So one of the things that we can do is, if you saw the naming convention and things like that, we can look up what the department name is. So let's say it's HR, and then what we can do is say, let's actually treat the HR teams differently to every other sort of department. So because we've added that metadata there and we've used the naming convention in such a way, we can drop that into a certain container, and then we can ensure that using something like our backup solution, that we're keeping that information a bit longer than everything else.
So one of the big challenges that I think the world's facing now, and I think this is almost a universal problem, is the level of uncertainty that we're facing around, you know, especially the next couple of months. And I'm getting this from a lot of IT departments and from a lot of business users, where the conversation is, listen, it's great. We've rapidly adopted this. We are seeing some problems coming up. How do we get about this? You know, the CIO isn't going to be signing off a big check right now. So how do we get started? Because we know we need to, right? And I think this is one of the very exciting initiatives that AvePoint's doing is called the Work from Home Jumpstart for Microsoft Teams. Now, effectively, and Daryl, correct me if I'm wrong, but effectively, this is an extended 3-month engagement where we deploy Teams, we get it up and running. There are some templates to get us using internal, external Teams, whether it's sensitive or it's, you know, it's confidential or not confidential. If I'm not mistaken, this is a 3-month trial that we can run.
Yes, it is. So it's no obligation. So this is our way of sort of helping people get up and running without sort of a cost implication, things like that. So it usually takes us a couple of days to get up and running with your IT department or whoever you choose to sort of involve in the process, and then no obligation for 3 months. you can use the software as long as you want. And if you decide at the end of it you don't require it, don't want to use it anymore, that's completely fine. But we've had a couple of organizations already start using it and go, this is fantastic, but we want to build out some other policies and things like that. And then they've actually committed to buying the software and start using it much earlier than that 3-month period. So it's been really, really good, and it's our way that we're happy to help people during this difficult time.
Yeah, so I actually got it started up for one of our clients, and the process is ridiculously simple, right? What's great about it is the fact that it's a SaaS offering. There's no sort of infrastructure that needs to get turned on. It just works out off the bat. We might need a little bit of help from IT, but that's about it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And what we've actually done as well, if you go onto our YouTube channel, we've created a lot of videos. So for those organizations that go, you know what, we want to get up and running, we're taking advantage of the free offering, but we want to empower ourselves to make some couple of tweaks around the outside, maybe change some things. We've provided all these videos, so people in my delivery team, they've gone and created some really fantastic content that walk you through how to make the different changes and customizations to your environment if that's something you want to do.
Well, that's awesome. I'm definitely going to go take a look at some of those videos. So look, everybody, we're going to be sharing the link. Make sure that everybody's that's attended the webinar is going to have this link to actually register for this. It's an incredibly simple process. So we'll distribute that later today. Okay, so look, Daryl, thank you so much for your time today. It's always great hearing from you. Thanks for sharing some of your insights and showing us some of the cool stuff AvePoint's doing.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me.
All right, cool. Thank you, everyone.